because that happens. We've all been on that Zoom call. And we'll be telling you later how to ask questions about gardening. So my co-host tonight, Marianne Higgins, the president of the Reading Garden Club, is going to be introducing tonight's guest. Marianne, take it away.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. I'm Marianne Higgins, president of the Reading Garden Club. And on behalf of the Reading Garden Club, I'm delighted to welcome you as we partner with the Reading Library to present tonight's program. During these times of isolation, the Garden Club is going to continue its mission to beautify Reading. We're going to have the planters at the town hall, plant Parker Tavern, and we're going to continue the Adopt an Island program throughout the town. If you'd like to find out more information about the Garden Club, if you'd like to join the Garden Club, if you would like to help water the sites in town that we take care of, or if you just want information about the Garden Club, please go to readinggardenclub.org and you'll find all that information there. Tonight's program is also going to fulfill our mission to educate the community. I'm going to introduce Claudia Thompson, who founded Grow Native Massachusetts. Its focus is on making conservation of the environment and landscapes a mainstream activity. Claudia will emphasize the importance of growing native plants to accomplish this, something that she's very passionate about. So I'm happy to introduce Claudia Thompson, who will present an inspiring and informative program on why native plant landscapes matter. Claudia?
Thank you very much, Marianne. I really appreciate the introduction. And we have our first slight technical issue. For some reason, the Zoom sequence has changed, and Meredith, you are gone from the top of the screen. So if you signal me, I'm not going to be able to see you. I don't know why with the four of us who were co-hosting are no longer appearing first. So Andrea, I don't know.
Can you see me now?
I can see you, Andrea, but Meredith disappeared down the chain somehow.
Okay, try on the upper right side of your screen, try going to, there's a double blue rectangle. So you can minimize it to the far left. You can make it so only the speaker is showing with one rectangle, or you can make it so there's a lineup of people showing. And in that view, I can see both you and Meredith and myself.
Yeah, I don't know. It switched on us from where we started. But Meredith, if you need to cue me, you're going to have to do it by sound.
I will do that.
Okay, thanks.
I will do that.
So anyway, back to the beginning. It's very nice to be back in Reading virtually. I've done a couple programs in the past for the Reading Garden Club, and thank you all for coming. It's fabulous to see this great turnout. And I am going to start by sharing my screen. And I hope that's working for everybody. Is that working, Meredith?
Yes, this is working.
All right. So gardening with native plants truly matters. And I want us to ask why. What is the real reason? And I'm sure you want to know. In order to know the why of why native plants matter, I want to first be sure we also have a conception of what native plants are, what we're talking about. We know plant is native to planet Earth. As of the moment, there are no extraterrestrials that I know of. So native plants are really local. They have evolved in the particular ecoregion they have been in for thousands or typically hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And that's given them a long time to adapt and to change in a close relationship with the other parts of that system. So for practical purposes here in New England, we call plants native that were here before this part of the world was colonized by Europeans. And another commonly used word is indigenous. And not every native plant has the same range. So let's take something like a red oak tree, which is native to much of Eastern North America. Red oaks are native from southern Canada, down the eastern seaboard, down towards Georgia and Florida, west to the Mississippi. So that's a very large range. Something like Potentilla tridentata, which is a favorite mountaintop wildflower that I love, is native just up the Appalachian chain from, say, Connecticut up to Greenland. So it has a very different range. So the range of every plant varies as to where it evolved. And we can take a quick look at the historical context for this issue going back 200 million years ago. It's currently thought that about 200 million years ago, all the land masses on Earth were one continent called Pangaea. And at that time on Earth, life was fairly primitive. Plant life was, relatively speaking, primitive. What's really, really fascinating about plants is that if you can see, can you all see the cursor here? Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Great. So flowering plants, which are called angiosperms here, are the more recently evolved plants in our systems. Flowering plants did not start evolving on Earth till here, about 125 million years ago, which was long after this continent of Pangaea began to separate into continents that were drifting apart across the globe. And that gives us a really logical explanation about why the species in North America are different than the species in Europe, are different than the species in Asia. Typically, we'll have the genus that's in common because the roots of the evolutionary history of the plants are similar, but the species themselves vary from continent to continent. Why is this important? And it goes to this principle of coevolution between plants and animals. Every ecosystem is very complex, very tightly balanced, and the coevolutionary relationships between the plants and animals and all of life within that system has had millions of years typically to adapt and evolve and find some kind of balance with one another. So there's a lot of talk today about pollinators and how pollinators are often very specific to certain plants. We also should realize that plants don't like to be eaten, just the same as animals don't like to be eaten. And when you think about it, most plants really aren't edible to most creatures. So if you were to go outside today and grab some leaves or stems from almost any plant you would see in the environment, if you ate it, you might have a very bad upset stomach. You might possibly get sick, but there are very few things that are out there that are actually edible to you. And the reason for that is for a plant to become edible to an animal, the animal has to adapt to the particular mechanisms of that plant to prevent itself from being eaten. So again, there's this long history of tight relationships between plants and animals. There's also a lot of relationships between butterflies and moths and plants. So we're talking about those today. The fancy word for butterflies and moths is Lepidoptera. A lot of butterflies and moths are host specific, and they may only be able to reproduce on one particular species of plants or a few particular species of plants. So again, this very complex set of relationships in the ecosystem depends on how the plants and animals evolve together. And the truth is, as ecologists, these relationships are so complex that we really don't know a whole lot about them. And yet we do know they exist, and we're discovering new things all the time. So let's go back to the question of why. Why are native plants so important? And the first answer is biodiversity, making sure our ecosystems are stable and continue as we know it. The ecosystem of New England is not the same as the ecosystem of Europe or of England itself or of Asia or of other parts of the earth. Now, the poster child for this issue of Late is, of course, the monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies have this amazing, amazing life cycle that was not understood until recently. And the work was done in the late 20th century, pioneered by a woman named Nora Urquhart. She was working with her husband in particular. And it took 30 years of study to unravel the mystery of monarch migration. So monarch butterflies here overwinter, most of them overwinter in Mexico in a particular forested region. And they, come spring, they will migrate from this part of Mexico up to, say, Texas here. And what happens then is the male and the female mate, lay their eggs on milkweed, and then the male and the female die, because that's what happens to butterflies after they mate. That's the end of their life cycle. If those eggs right here were laid on milkweed, they will hatch into little larvae. The larvae will eat the milkweed, which is again essentially the only genus of plants that it can eat. And then the larvae will pupate into adult butterflies. Those adult butterflies will probably fly north to, say, Missouri. And the same cycle will happen again. And then the third generation may fly to Ohio or southern New York or Pennsylvania. And then that cycle will happen again. And then it'll take 4 or 5 generations for those monarch butterflies to get all the way to our home here in New England. In the fall, that last generation of monarchs for the year flies all the way back to Mexico. So how in the world do these monarch butterflies know 5 generations later that they're supposed to fly back to Mexico? It's a complete miracle. We do not yet understand how that transmission of knowledge happens between those generations, but we do understand now the complexity of the monarch-milkweed relationship. So if you want to support life for monarch butterflies here in New England, there are 5 species of milkweed that you can use. A common milkweed is the really vigorous one that grows in the fields that is beautiful, has that kind of purpley flower. It spreads stoloniferously, so it's good in a garden if you have lots of space. Swamp milkweed is a great plant. It doesn't actually really have to be that wet for you to grow swamp milkweed. What's shown here is the butterfly weed, the Asclepias tuberosa, very beautiful orange flowers, etc. So one incredibly precious example of a very important coevolutionary relationship between monarch butterflies and one genus of plants. So when we think about New England and the introduction of non-native plants in New England, it really didn't happen until relatively recently, about 400 years ago, beginning with European colonization. And what was the reason for non-native plants to be brought? The biggest reason is us gardener types and horticulturists who happen to like plants. So it was pretty understandable that botanists traveling to another continent would say, oh my God, here's this incredible plant. We don't have anything like that back home. Maybe take this back home so we can see it in England, or so that people bring in here with big plants from England or Europe that they love, that they wanted to bring with them. But the main reason plants got introduced is because we like how they look. We like how they grow. We like their interest. The second biggest reason that plants have been brought across continents and across ecosystems is for so-called conservation purposes. And great plants were brought here, like, guess what? Kudzu and many other plants that we found out later didn't behave very well in their new ecosystem, and we would no longer think of them as good plants for conservation. So I guess the good side of that lesson is we learn things over time. Some plants were also brought here for herbal and medicinal purposes, plants like garlic, mustard, and inevitably with both plants and animals, you have accidental introductions that nobody intended. But those are small and compared to the deliberate introductions. If we think about the New England ecosystem, before European settlement, there was a very intact ecosystem, and the Native Americans had a lot of different ways that they used the landscape and used plants. However, the time scale was very different than it was post-European settlement. And the Native Americans didn't clear land for agriculture the way European settlers did. So once European settlement happened, there started to be more dramatic changes in the landscape, particularly with the introduction of agriculture and farming. Now, the peak of farming in New England was right around the time of the Civil War. And so if you travel around New England, you know there are tons of stone walls. You can see the historical references to how much of the land was farmed, often far up mountainsides where you still find stone walls that mark the fields. Once the Civil War happened, farming started to move westward. Settlers moving west towards Ohio and Midwestern landscapes discovered there weren't nearly as many rocks in the soil out there. Trains were being developed. Produce could be shipped more than it had been in the past. So after the Civil War, a lot of that land that had been farmed and had become field grew back in. But it grew back in largely as native plants, as what we could now call second growth forests and sometimes third growth forests that were recolonized. The fields were recolonized by native plants. If we look at the landscape, so to speak, of plants found in Massachusetts today, and I'm just going to talk about plants that can reproduce on their own in the landscape, not agricultural crops that are limited to being planted by human beings. So just plants that can reproduce themselves. There are a little less than 3,000 species of plants in Massachusetts. And of those species, about 2/3 or 1,800 are native plants, and close to 1,000 are introduced non-native plants that were brought here deliberately, again, after colonization. Now, that's the species mix, but it doesn't mean that about 2/3 of the plant biomass in Massachusetts is native, because of those 1,800 native species, a very large percentage are endangered or considered of conservation concern. And they're rare plants that we're at risk of losing. If you start to think about the landscape out in Massachusetts and you look at how much human impact is, the biomass itself is trending much more to the non-native landscape than the native landscape. Now, of these 900 non-native species that have been introduced, they really run the gamut. They're all over the map in terms of their behavior. Some of them, like lilacs, for example, are not at all invasive, but they didn't really co-evolve here with our ecosystem, so they don't necessarily have a lot of ecological contribution to make. On the other hand, over here, on the most problematic end are the invasive species. It's pretty amazing when you think that about 145 of the species that have been introduced here are invasive, now considered invasive, so more than 10% of the species. And Massachusetts now has a prohibited plant list to regulate these invasive species. And I'll bet you know lots of them. Here in the top left, we have black swallowwort, a problematic, very aggressive, twining, viney species with these seed pods that are long and release a milkweed type seed. We have Oriental bittersweet. I'm sure everybody knows Oriental bittersweet. It kills trees by strangling them. It drowns them, their canopies. We have Japanese knotweed here that grows through asphalt. Its root systems can grow 9 or 10 feet deep, which is why it's so hard to get rid of. And then we have Norway maple, which is this one here in the bottom right. Norway maple was actually introduced deliberately because it was supposed to be a great street tree. So Dutch elm disease back in the early 1900s killed off a lot of the street tree canopy, the beautiful elm canopies that made up the main streets of the eastern United States. And people discovered that Norway maples, they thought, were a great replacement. They were hardy trees. They could withstand salt. They could withstand tough conditions. They could withstand compaction. And so Norway maples started to be used extensively as street trees. And guess what? Norway maples are now on the Massachusetts prohibited plant list. As I said, there are 145 species that the Department of Agricultural Resources and Mass regulates. That what it means to be on the prohibited plant list, which was introduced or became effective in 2006, is that it's no longer legal to plant, transport, purchase, sell, or in any way aid the reproduction of any of these species. You can't dig them up and give them to your friends. You can't, the reason you can't transport them is so you don't accidentally spread the seed, etc. So some of these others, I'm sure you would know as well. Garlic mustard. This is garlic mustard in its second year. Garlic mustard is a biennial. It has a 2-year life cycle. This is garlic mustard in the first year in the top right corner here. And it doesn't flower until the second year. So if you pull it in its first year, there's no chance it can go to seed. We also have the Japanese barberry here, which gardeners used to plant a great deal. I've never loved Japanese barberry because I think it's prickly and I'm not sure it's really that pretty. And then we have Japanese honeysuckle. Japanese honeysuckle is the one that has the really nice scent, that has that nice taste if you suck it and put it in your mouth. But it is very, very aggressive spreader that will drown out most of the rest of anything growing around it. And that is also on the prohibited list. There are, by the way, a whole bunch of native honeysuckles that one can use instead.
Claudia,
So
quick
let's
reminder
yeah.
that if people have questions, they can put them into the chat window.
Yes, my apologies. I forgot to mention in the very beginning that if you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat window. And if it's an urgent question, Meredith will interrupt me so that I can answer it, or she'll answer it herself. And then at the end of the talk, she is going to curate all these questions and kind of group together the questions that are related. And we will answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. So, all right. So just to be sure we are good on our terminology here, we've talked about what native means, that these are plants that have had a long time to evolve here in this ecosystem. So if they're non-native, they were introduced by humans in a very sudden way. It wasn't until European colonization that we were able to bring ships here, bring plants on ships, planes, trains, automobiles. Again, it was the sudden introduction of plants into the ecosystem that has caused problems. Sometimes people confuse native and naturalized, and naturalized does not at all mean native. A naturalized plant is something that is able to reproduce on its own in the landscape, but it might have been brought here as a non-native. In fact, it often is. So good examples of naturalized plants are Queen Anne's lace, common lilacs, Callery pears, etc. And then invasive, people tend to have different definitions of invasive, but again, the Massachusetts regulates invasives here, and there's a whole process by which those plants get put on that list. Every state in New England has its own invasive plant regulations, with the exception of Rhode Island that has recommendations. They're not legally binding laws, but there are recommendations. But to get on an invasive list, you have to be a pretty bad plant. It has to be demonstrated that you do substantial damage to the ecosystems where you have been introduced. So, why not use that non-native Cornus crusa in your garden? instead of a Cornus florida? And the answer to that is really simple. Cornus cruces did not evolve here with our fauna. And so they actually do not host insects and arthropods. They don't have a lot of ecological value here in New England. On the other hand, our Cornus florida, the beautiful native dogwood, which is shown here, hosts at least 117 species of moths and butterflies and insects. And that is a good thing. In the 1950s and 60s, when I grew up, and we used to have things like DDT, there was a general trend in society to get rid of every insect, regardless of whether it was good or bad or valuable to the ecosystem. I think we're hopefully starting to get beyond those days. Insects are critical parts of our ecosystem. And so this is a really one important slide. If you remember no other slide tonight, take a good look at this one and put it in your visual memory. The reason native plants are essential for biodiversity is because they host insects. Now, that's a pretty cute white marked tussock moth on a Swampelzalia, the plant that was in my garden. And I was walking around the garden with a neighbor, and she saw this moth caterpillar, this caterpillar moth, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, are you gonna let that thing stay there?" And I looked at her and I said, "Well, yeah, of course I'm gonna let that stay there. For one thing, it's pretty cute. And for another thing, it's gonna be bird food in a few minutes." So without insects and without arthropods, we just don't have a food web. There's no food for birds, no amphibian life at all, no salamanders, no food web. Our friend E.O. Wilson is the one who coined the great phrase, insects are the little things that run the world. So the fact that native plants host insects and that makes life possible for birds and amphibians and the rest of the entire food web is why they are essential. So here we have a palm warbler, and that palm warbler is eating a caterpillar. And fortunately, we have insects to keep insects in balance. So here we have a spider eating a fly. And then we all love great blue herons, and that great blue heron is eating a frog, but what did the frog just eat? The frog just ate insects. So there's the food web at work. And again, our friend E.O. Wilson sums it up saying, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And that's really true. If we had no insects at all, as of tomorrow, life would just completely cease. What's important is that we keep our ecosystems in balance. And what I love about this little picture right here is that this is some Cornus racemosa, some gray dogwood in my garden. And you can see here a little hole and a little hole. And that means that that gray dogwood is being eaten by a few insects. But it's fine, it's doing healthy, it's happy in my garden because the system is in balance. It's only if we have an infestation and insects get out of balance that we have a problem. And typically that happens with non-native insects much more than invasive ones. So this is Doug Talamine. And Doug is, I'm hoping many of you have heard of him. Doug is an entomologist and a professor of entomology and wildlife biology at the University of Delaware. In 2007, Doug published the book Bringing Nature Home, which just absolutely catapulted him to fame. And in it, he really made the case for native plants and really started to document how important insects are as intermediaries in the food web between plants and between the rest of the ecosystem. So it's a fabulous book. If you have not read it, you should read it. And then just this year, Doug's third book came out, Nature's Best Hope, and it picks up on these same themes and puts them in even bigger context. In that book, he really dramatically makes the case about how developed all of our landscape is and why we humans and what we do in all of our gardens and all of our landscapes is so important to the future. It's hard to recommend one of these books over the other. I really recommend both of them, and I hope you will check them out. Doug sums up his entomological research, and he's done tremendous amounts of it over decades and decades with lots of graduate students getting their PhDs, by saying that his research has shown that native ornamental plants support 29 times the biodiversity more than alien ornamentals. So there we go. There's reason number one for why native plants are so essential to our future. Biodiversity and the stability of local ecosystems. Now, the second reason is our other, probably most current dramatic environmental crisis of the day, and that's climate change. Using native plants, and in particular using them in conjunction with ecological landscaping processes, are absolutely fundamental approaches to addressing climate change, where we gardeners and landscapers can make a very big difference. I could have put up any number of 1,000 charts to dramatize the growing effects or growing documentation of climate change. This one is just a good example. It shows worldwide carbon dioxide emissions essentially from 1850 until almost the present. And the chart speaks for itself. So we know that climate change has been exponentially increasing since World War II. The increase in greenhouse gases, mean global temperatures, the rise of the ocean temperatures, the loss of the glaciers and ice sheets, the sea level rise, which is documented, the irregular weather patterns, drought, hurricanes, excessive rainfall. So how in the world can native plants and our landscapes help with that? And here's how. You'll often hear it said that using native plants requires less water and less fertilizer than non-native plants. Now, that's a little bit of a oversimplification, so let's tease that apart a little bit. First thing I want to say is that every time you establish plants, you have absolutely got to pay attention to watering them in their establishment phase. So you can't just take native plants and plunk them down in the ground and think they're going to be fine. But that said, there's a lot of truth in this statement, and the truth is this. If you pick the plants that are well adapted to your soil and to your hydrologic conditions, i.e. the type of rainfall you get, how well your soil holds moisture, etc. If you pick the species that are adapted to that, indeed you are going to require much less water long-term, and you're not going to need to amend your soil with chemical fertilizers, particularly if you let your soil ecosystem work and you have good, healthy soil with organic leaf litter and material that helps replenish that soil. If you take that ecological approach, you don't need chemical fertilizers at all. And in fact, the chemical fertilizer industry is an outgrowth of World War II and the creation of lots of munitions. And so nitrogen was an important element in creating bombs and ammunition. And that gave rise to the growth of the fertilizer, the chemical fertilizer industry in particular in America and other parts of the world. So there's not a lot good that can be said about these chemical fertilizers. There's a lot of pollution caused in creating them, in manufacturing them. When you use chemical fertilizers, there tends to be a tremendous amount of runoff that pollutes our water supplies. When you add these chemical fertilizers to the soil, you're actually diminishing its capacity to work organically, and the soil becomes much poorer and is not able to sustain itself. And so there's basically no reason that you want to be using them. When the soil becomes dependent on chemical fertilizers, one of the worst things that happens from a climate change point of view is the soil loses its natural capacity to store carbon. And both meadows and woodlands, our tree canopy, are very, very important. The soil for those two ecosystems are very, very important in storing carbon. So if we have healthy soils and healthy meadows and healthy woodlands and healthy gardens, we're actually capturing carbon in the soil. So when we use native plants, we have this huge opportunity to completely use ecological processes as our system for managing our gardens. So in the fall, I recommend that you leave your leaf litter and your decaying vegetation, your meadow vegetation, so that it becomes the natural mulch that stays there over winter from fall to spring. That will do a tremendous amount to start to make your soil healthy so that it can absorb more carbon dioxide. You won't be trucking mulch in that has all kinds of inputs from manufacturing it and transporting it, and you'll be saving a lot of resources. The other thing you can do with your native plant gardening that's really important is to plant things everywhere so that you don't need mulch at all. The understory of your garden and having plantings everywhere is really important, and it makes your garden beautiful. And you don't need to have the single plants with mulch surrounding them when you have a rich garden with plants everywhere at different levels from high to low. Here's an example from my garden of a little meadow edge. And you can see over here remnants of the leaf litter that I've left over the winter in the background, but it's growing in nicely. And I didn't use any, I left the leaf litter there. I didn't bring in any mulch. I have no need for leaf blowers to spout carbon dioxide into the air, and things are coming in nicely. So in sum, imagine if we did that exclusively. The gardening industry is commonly called the green industry, but in so many ways, conventional gardening is ecologically not green at all. The impact is not good. On the other hand, we have the opportunity to turn that around completely as gardeners, to use ecological processes and to really make a positive impact environmentally with how we manage our landscapes. So to sum up, the growing human impact in the last century has had a lot of negative consequences. We've fragmented our habitat into lots of smaller parcels, resulting in challenges to wildlife and to biodiversity. We're getting big declines in migrating songbirds and amphibians and all kinds of species, and we have serious, serious problems with climate change. 17 of the 18 warmest years on record have occurred just since 2000. I think this is going to illustrate why that's been happening here. We go back to World War II as a starting reference point, and this map shows the housing density in the United States. And just to see what's happened since 1940, this is 1960, this is 1990, this is 2010. And if you look at this, and we're already 10 years beyond that, you see that Massachusetts over here is almost half in deep red, meaning that the housing density in Massachusetts is well over 16 housing units per square kilometer, and often much denser than that. So that's why at Grow Native, our motto is every garden matters, every landscape counts. If this is a lot of what our landscape looks like today, then we can do so much more than this to improve our ecosystem and to make a healthier world. It's great that there are a whole lot of trees growing here, but I would advocate for much bigger changes than that. And we'll take a look at my garden as a case study. So thank you to Google Earth. We can zoom down into my garden, and I live in the western part of Cambridge, over near Fresh Pond, which is the city water supply. And it's a neighborhood with some nice street tree canopy, and it is still a fairly dense part of the city over here. You can see where I'm zooming into. And here we are. This is the lot. The lot is 7,300 square feet, or about 1/6 of an acre. It's a street full of mostly two-family houses. And the footprint of our two-family house is about 1/3 of the lot. So probably compared to many of you, if you're out in the Reading area, less space than you might have to garden with, but for Cambridge, it's a decent amount of space. Well, this is what it looked like in 1992 when my husband and I bought the house. And it was we've been looking hard to find a house in Cambridge, and we found the wreck of the street that was definitely in need of a lot of work. This is what it looked like in back, and there wasn't a whole lot that had been tended to there. There were a few conventional plantings left from a prior owner in the 1950s and 60s. The neighbor had this huge elm tree at the time, which was overhanging the garden. But over here, there was a lot of unused space and a brush pile and a few trees, some of which were native and some of which were invasive. Well, after about 20 years of work on the garden, that's what it looks like recently. So that's where the garage was. And I just want to say that I started out as a very conventional gardener. I had grown up in a wooded area. I had a sense of land, but my knowledge of gardening was, and even though I was an environmental educator and I taught natural history and things like that, I would say in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 1990s, I did not think of my garden originally as ecologically significant. But that changed a lot over time. So I started out, when we took down that decrepit old garage and went out to Weston Nurseries, and my husband and I bought a carload of plants for us to start planting. I just bought what looked pretty. I did what virtually everybody does. I looked at the cold hardy charts to see what would grow in my zone and chose what appealed to me at the time without a lot of planning or awareness of certainly ecological principles. But what happened for me to change my point of view was that starting in the 1990s, the 1990s I think was the decade where we really started to become aware of invasive plants. I had 11 different invasive species on my property, including an old Norway maple at the back, a little teeny bit of bittersweet, a little teeny bit of Japanese knotweed, goutweed, buckthorn, etc. So in a few short years, I tackled those invasives and got rid of them. And then I started using native plants. And the more I used native plants, the more I liked them. And then my whole sense of gardening changed with time and what happened. So I'm going to give you a tour of some parts of my garden. Those trees that you saw back in the previous picture are shadbush trees. And this is actually photographed from today of how beautiful they look. We've had such a cold spring and they look absolutely beautiful. They're one of the first native trees to blossom, and very delicate blossoms that mark the beginning of spring. I love the common name shadbush. There's several common names for these trees, shadbush or shadblow, because they bloom when the shad are running in the streams. They're also commonly called Juneberry because the berries ripen in June, and they are commonly called serviceberry trees, and that is because that when they bloom, the ground generally had thawed enough in New England for colonists to bury the dead. So the common names of species can give us a whole lot of interesting hints about the uses of plants from time to time. Now, the understory, I would say the The woodland part of my garden here, which was actually where the garage was originally, you still see kind of the remnant of the garage and the old asphalt where we didn't take it all up, is one of the more successful parts of my garden that I love a lot. In the understory, had masses of bloodroot that originally started from just 4 plants that are absolutely beautiful. Bloodroot are a lot like crocuses, and they open up in the spring when the pollinators are just arriving and the petals open up like a crocus. When the sun goes away, the petals close. When they're pollinated and the seeds are starting to form, the petals drop off. This is bloodroot that the flowers come out first, and you can see the leaf here, and the leaves unfurl beautifully, absolutely gorgeous leaves. Another understory plant that I really, really like is Uvularia sicilifolia, also called spreading bellwort. And here it is mixed with Anemonella phylacteroides. And these have been out in my garden for the past, again, we've had such a cool last few weeks. These have actually been up and emerging very slowly for the last few weeks, right as the Amelanchier are blooming. What's nice about these understory plants, is the understory of my garden, is that as it grows in, everything grows together. So these are the bloodroot leaves here, and once they've opened up, mixed in with some yellow lady slipper, and of course you have to love things like lady slippers. If you want to have lady slippers in your woodland garden, be sure you buy cultivated varieties. The pink lady slipper is not available as a cultivated variety because it really cannot be cultivated. Please do not dig them out of the woods, but yellow lady slippers are available at places like Garden in the Woods. There are also phlox stolonifera. I love how the phlox grows in certain woodland areas. It grows in around my stone walkway. And as I said, I really believe in creating an understory that's just as interesting as the trees or the shrubs growing above it. And what's really neat about the woodland part of my garden is as everything emerges in the spring, it fills in quite nicely. I have Jack in the pulpit, and this is Jack here in the pulpit. It's a really cool wildflower. I have Jack in the pulpit and Trillium grandiflorum growing together. One way you can tell them apart, this is Jack in the pulpit here, which the veins of the leaf have a central vein with these straight veins radiating out from the central one. The Trillium here has a central vein, and it has a curved vein growing around it. But the fascinating thing about both Trilliums and Jack in the pulpits is that they take a really long time to reproduce and grow to maturity so that they flower again. The seed of a Jack in the pulpit is estimated to take around 5 years between when it first germinates and when the plant grows large enough every year to finally develop its own flower. And the same thing for Trillium. These seeds have to cold stratify. They have to live in the ground over the cold New England winters before they germinate. A Trillium seed is estimated to take 1 or 2 years to first sprout, and about 7 years from when it first sprouts till when it first flowers. Now, when these plants grow in the first year, they come up and they're absolutely teeny, and that's all they're going to do. And they'll senesce, and winter will come, and then the next year they'll grow a little bit bigger. But just imagine it taking 7 years before you produce your first flower. So that's another reason why this leaf litter behind here is very important, which is those plants won't reproduce unless they're undisturbed, so that those seeds can drop into the soil, germinate, and the little seedlings can come each year and grow back each year until they become big enough to flower. If you cover those with mulch and scrape up the mulch and do all the conventional gardening every year, your Jack in the pulpits are not going to reproduce and your Trilliums are not going to reproduce, and you don't get that incredible benefit. But I have a little section of my garden that I call my Jack in the pulpit farm, And actually the trilliums have reproduced too. I mean, the squirrels do a number on them now and then, but I have growing clusters of trillium. It takes a while, but they're definitely worth it. And here's Jack in the Pulpit in the fall. And you can see that it is going to seed, and those seeds are going to drop to the ground, and you want to let them stay there in the leaf litter and not disturb that if you want your baby Jack in the Pulpits and trilliums. I also have some interesting wet spots. When we get a heavy rain, the back of my garden floods a little bit, and I like that. So here I have in the back some mayapple and sensitive fern. They both like wet conditions. They're fine when it dries out. They make good companion plants. I think one of the hardest lessons for all of us as gardeners is to learn that we want to match the competitive ability of plants with one another. It's tough when you put a really competitive plant next to a very delicate plant, and the competitive plant will run over the delicate plant pretty quickly. But if you match the competitiveness of these species, and some people think of both mayapple and sensitive fern as somewhat aggressive, then they kind of balance each other out. So they make a nice combination. I love the native dogwoods, or the native, rhododendrons. This is Rhododendron vasei, which is a little bit hard to get, but a very delicate native azalea that its true native range is a little bit south of here, but it does quite well here in our region. In the front of my garden, I'm a big fan of the American dogwood, the Cornus florida. People were worried for years that they wouldn't survive anthracnose, and they have been surviving anthracnose. And we can't give up on these beautiful plants. They're really, really important ecologically. Again, much more important than the non-native dogwoods, and they're gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Here's a mix of some ostrich fern at the back. Ostrich fern are the ones that produce the edible fiddleheads that you can eat and that you buy in stores. There's some Viburnum dentatum here in front, and some Tiarella cordifolia, just a nice edge along a fence line. Summer sweet, also called Clethra olifolia, is a fantastic plant. It also likes, ideally, to have its feet wet. It's a great plant for pollinators. Here you see a bumblebee collecting a lot of pollen on its pollen sac. It smells absolutely gorgeous,
I got it.
Which is why it's called summer sweet. And so this is a little back section of my garden with the Clethra, and it has beautiful winter interest. It's an absolutely gorgeous plant in the fall and into the winter. That particular, this is the group of summer sweet right here. There's this little central section in the back of my garden where I tend to get the wet spots in the spring, or sometimes when we have a really heavy rain. And there's an absolutely nice mix of plants here. Here's the blue lobelia, also called blue cardinal flower, or Lobelia syphilitica. There's some high bush blueberry right here. There's some summer sweet. There's some cinnamon fern. There's these little grasses right here are Carex appalachia. There's some marsh marigold, which is here, which is blooming right now in the spring, and a few other species as well. And I love this kind of little central spot. It's also anchored by a nice river birch tree, of which I've planted several. They work well for me because they love clay soil, and I have a lot of clay soil in Cambridge. Other great spots over time have been a witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, in my garden. This is a shrub type tree, a small tree that blooms in November or December and is absolutely gorgeous when it's blooming and there's snowflakes coming down. I have tried hard to grow high bush blueberry and low bush blueberry in my garden, and frankly, they don't really work very well because they don't like clay soil. They would much prefer acidic soil, and so I've learned some lessons the hard way about those. But this is high bush blueberry I keep in a pot at my back door because I love the fall color. And I hope it's a plant that if you have the right conditions for, you'll fall in love with too. Ceanothus americanus is a native, very tough shrub, also called New Jersey tea. great for pollinators, well adapted to very tough conditions that's become more available of late. And I'm also a very big fan of the winter berries, Ilex verticillata. It's the plant that gets the beautiful red berries in winter. Also a plant that's loved by pollinators here. It's being visited by honeybee. But it's also extremely important to our native bees. There are about 300 species of native bees here in Massachusetts. So getting back to our question of the big why use native plants? I would say the third reason is they are beautiful. I have today about 120 species of native plants in my garden. Well, most of them are native, probably 95 to 97%. I'm not advocating that you do that. I'm a plantaholic, and so I can't resist trying new things all the time. I've probably tried to squeeze in too many species, but I will say that I have loved working with them, and I hope you will fall in love more and more with them and with their beauty. So I love the plants. That's very true. And I have to confess, I think I love the birds at least as much. So I want to go back to this issue of biodiversity and protecting life as we know it on the planet. Birds are, to some extent, a very good indicator species of the health of our landscapes. And what has gotten both me and my husband very excited about the garden as we made it more and more native is we began to notice more and more birds. So much so that by about the year, let's see, probably 2010, maybe a little bit before that, I actually began trying to document all the species of birds that I found using our garden every year. And it's been pretty exciting and pretty amazing. Now let's think for a minute about what life is like for our birds and why they're declining. Migrating wood thrush, the thrushes are in steep decline. They're on the watch list. They're at increasing risk of extinction. They're one of 4 other species of thrush we have migrating through New England every year. So they winter down here in Central America. And twice a year they fly up here in the spring and back down in the fall. A wood thrush only weighs about a pound and about an ounce and a half. Sorry, what am I saying? An ounce and a half. And here it is flying a couple thousand miles twice a year. It nests on low branches or, and it forages for insects in the leaf litter. So one reason we are losing the thrushes is that nobody has leaf litter anymore. We don't have any forests anymore. It's not surprising we're losing them. Cats are killing them. They're very vulnerable down there in this low ground level habitat. So I am very happy to say that often over the years, I have seen wood thrushes migrating through my garden and using it on their way to, they don't nest in Cambridge. They tend to nest further out in larger woodlands. But I am very, very happy to have provided some habitat for them on the way. And in total, to date, I have actually recorded 80 species, actually now 81 species of birds using my garden. And I think that is way cool. And I love seeing the birds, and I get excited every time they are there, particularly the ones that are rare. I think about 45 to 50 of these species I would hope to see every year. I'm a little bit worried about that because birds diversity is really declining, and I have seen significant differences in the last few years, even beyond the data that we have. 45 of the species that have been visiting my garden are these neotropical migrants that come from Central America and South America and migrate north every year. And of all the species I've documented, about half of them are species of conservation concern, and 2 of them, the wood thrush and the American woodcock, are both watch list species that are at risk of extinction. So again, this is where what all of us can do as gardeners is so, so important. Why do I get this much bird life? And this is a sharp-shinned hawk that's sitting in a river birch, probably looking for another bird to catch. But the reason that I get them is, of course, obvious. There's habitat, there's food. Here's a kingbird hanging out also on the river birch, a red-bellied woodpecker, the Wilson's warbler in the Amelanchier trees. And what I love about this is you can see that the Wilson's warbler is eating a caterpillar. So while the Amelanchier has berries and is commonly called Juneberry, the Amelanchier is really feeding this Wilson's warbler insects, going back to insects being so important to bird life. American robins, we all have robins. Robins are actually on the increase, nesting as if we couldn't see it. I've had a scarlet tanager visit my back garden. Gray catbirds, ruby-throated hummingbirds. At cardinal flower is a great native plant for hummingbirds. The American goldfinch, which is eating the thuya seeds. Thuya is also known as arborvitae, and every November, these ripened seeds, the goldfinches like to come and eat. I have red-tailed hawks that have visited and eaten squirrel. I root for them to eat as many squirrels as possible. I've seen them actually eat crows, believe it or not. So again, overall in the garden, in my garden, there's over 90% of the plants are native, and they in turn are hosting a lot of insects, and the insects are providing food for the birds. There's this rich understory of leaf litter, places for insects to grow, and the birds that want to forage within the leaf litter, and butterfly reproduction happens. All kinds of things are happening in that leaf litter. And I want to finish by telling you one more bird story. So this is a view of the back garden some years ago, probably about 10 years ago, a little bit more. A long time before that, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I planted this river birch right here, this one that you can see, because I didn't like that this silver maple, which is what this was smack in the middle of my back garden. So I thought, okay, I will plant the river birch, and then eventually I will take the silver maple down, and the river birch will replace the silver maple. But by the time it came to fully take down the silver maple, I wanted to do an experiment, which was let me leave that standing piece of deadwood as a snag and see if I can get woodpeckers to nest in my Cambridge garden. And my husband and I were a little worried that it wouldn't stick out like a sore thumb, but this is during the growing season, and you see that, you know, in the growing season, even when we first created the snag, you didn't really notice it that much, particularly when the river birch filled it. And I have to tell you that I'm so excited that my experiment worked. So after standing there, it took 5 years of that snag being there before the wood got soft enough for the woodpeckers to find it useful. Well, 5 years later, this is in 2013, we had a warm April, and my husband and I were sitting on the back porch, and we saw the first woodpecker, this downy woodpecker with a red patch on the back of its head, making its nest hole. And it had probably been working for several days since the hole was established. Then a beautiful northern flicker came by to check out the hole, but the downy woodpecker was not giving up its hole. It was working hard, and it was working for several hours a day, and harder and harder. It took it at least 2 weeks before it could get that far into the hole, spitting the wood chips out all the time, and then finally get in far enough to turn its head around. And you knew it was making a nice cavity inside this snag. Then the female, a downy woodpecker, came by. You can tell she's a female because she doesn't have the red spot at the back of her head. And she's checking out the male's work. And then there was some fluttering around of the male and female together. And I was kind of like, I don't know if I'm supposed to watch this part. And then it got very, very, very quiet. And we were not sure, my husband and I were not sure whether they had successfully made a nest. However, On May 31st, so about 6 weeks after I first noticed the hole being drilled, here's the female, and we started hearing lots of noise and whining and all from young woodpeckers inside the hole. And if you look at this female, she's got about 6 or 8 caterpillars right there in her mouth that she is bringing to them to feed. And there is a very voracious young male woodpecker, and you can't see the red spot on the back of his head, but it was there. We knew he was a male. And he was whining and complaining and asking mom and dad to bring him caterpillar after caterpillar, and they would, it's an estimated to take somewhere on the order of 5,000 to 7,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of birds, a small clutch of birds. It's going to be a little different with every species, but it's true. The male and female are running back and forth all the time, feeding these young ones. And finally, on June 1st, the parents stopped feeding the young ones quite so much. And all of a sudden, this little guy thrust himself out of the hole, grabbed the side of the tree, climbed, or the snag, climbed up to the top of the snag, rested for a minute, flew over to the Amelanchier trees where you can see that the berries are there, but they're not ripe yet. So he didn't get much food off of the berries. He flew back to the Chamaecyparis in the middle of the yard, and he just hung there for a minute and rested. This guy had not been out of the nest hole for about 6 minutes. And then finally, after catching his breath, he started eating a few insects little by little, going up the side of the tree, and he flew off out of the yard. 12 minutes from fledging, he's flying off, ready to survive in the world, eating virtually nothing but insects. Well, in the hole was his little sister, and we knew she was a female, and she hadn't gotten quite as much food as he had, because I think he'd been standing on her head to get more of the caterpillars. But she was there for a few more days, and the parents did not feed her as much. They wanted her to come out and see what she could do. And sure enough, about 3 days later, I came back from a meeting. I was checking the hole every day, and there she was. She had fledged. She was high up in the tree. She had a little bit of a whine, and she was less vigorous, but she too, after about 30 minutes, flew off on her own into the world. So I would say that one story has been an absolute highlight of my work here in my garden, to know that I could sit on my back porch for several months, having coffee in the morning or occasionally on the afternoon, and watching these woodpeckers make their nest, watching the little ones fledge and grow up, has just been a real highlight of my Cambridge garden. And think about it, when we're creating habitat, there's so many ways that we want to do this. Just a couple principles. Vertical edge is to have a lot of canopy. You want to have high trees. You want to have mid-level size trees. You want to have low shrubs. You want to have the groundwater with the leaf litter. You want to have lots and lots of layers, because different birds will occupy different layers of the canopy. The orioles here, the Baltimore orioles, want to be very high up. You always see those at the very tops of the trees. If you have a snag, if you have to nesting hole, they're great for things like screech owls, and screech owls nest in the city all the time. You have the goldfinches that are down there more at the lower level or the mid-level of the canopy. You want to have water. If you want to attract birds, water's important. You want to provide cover of all kinds, and you don't want to use pesticides, because birds will really be, particularly raptors, get killed by pesticides. Pesticides bioaccumulate in the food chain. If a mouse eats a pesticide and a raptor eats the mouse, the raptor gets the pesticide. So again, habitat's important, and there's a lot we can all do to encourage this beautiful bird life in our gardens. So here are the 3 big whys, one more time. We absolutely need native plants if we are going to preserve life as we know it on this planet, if we're going to maintain biodiversity. We're in an area an age of extinction. And unless we gardeners and until we gardeners really change our habits dramatically, that's going to continue. The beauty is we can all do this. And that's the importance of taking action. Everything we do to garden organically, to leave leaf litter, etc., helps with ecological processes and mitigating climate change. And we've got to love the plants. So remember, leave your leaves. Leaf litter is the best and cheapest mulch you can get. It gets delivered free every year. You don't have to truck it in. You don't have to shovel it out. In the leaf litter, here are just a few fantastic examples of life that happens. I hope some of you have seen these guys. This is a hummingbird moth, and the hummingbird moths pupate, and their cocoon is spun in the leaf litter. So if that leaf litter is disturbed or collected and picked up every fall and not left there, we won't have any more hummingbird moths. And these are gorgeous, gorgeous little moths that at first, they're smaller than a hummingbird. But if you see one in your garden, I don't think you'll forget it. They're really cool. Bumblebees. We have many species of bumblebees. Several of them are really at risk. It is only the queen that survives the winter. And so if that queen doesn't survive the winter, we won't have bumblebees. The queen hibernates in the ground right under the leaf litter. She does not dig a deep hole. So again, leaf litter is very important for protecting queen bumblebees. And amazingly enough, this is a mourning cloak butterfly here. Mourning cloak butterflies actually overwinter as adults in the leaf litter. And I have seen them early in the spring emerging. Sometimes their wings are a little bit tattered and you just think, how did this creature survive this? But yes, they have to have leaf litter to survive and reproduce in the next spring. So finally, I want to leave you with a couple of my 3 top pieces of advice for success in working with native plants. The first thing I would say is understand your site. Learn what your conditions are. Learn what your soil is like. And then really research your plants to see what species do fit your site and your conditions. And I wish when I had started my gardening here in Cambridge 25, 30 years ago, I had understood that concept more. It would have saved me a lot of time and effort. And then finally, your garden is an ecological system, no matter how well you treat it or how you don't treat it well. But it is an ecological system, and the more you start working with it, I think the more you will enjoy it, in addition to doing lots of good things for the planet. At Grow Native Massachusetts, it's our goal to inspire you to action on behalf of native plants and the diversity of life that they support. I am sure that your garden matters absolutely just as much as mine. And I would encourage you to sign up for our free e-letter, our e-news. We will not overload you. We'll only send you a couple a month. Generally, we try to do 1 newsy letter a month and then a couple program announcements or plant sale announcements or things about current events. You can sign up for our e-news on our website if you're not getting it already. And I'm also just going to take a brief minute to show you a little bit of our website, because there's so many resources and information that we have there for you to use. We call ourselves an open source organization, and what that means is we provide a tremendous amount of resources for you, whether you support us or not. However, we do hope that if you care about this issue, you will support us and become a member and make a contribution once a year to make our work possible. And that's what allows us to have the website for you and other great programs. So let me just see if I can switch to the website right now. And is that working?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So here's our homepage. And we have a couple really cool photos to inspire you. Here's that hummingbird moth visiting some bee balm at a garden. And if you want to read the full caption, you just pop on that and it'll tell you what's going on in the photo. And if you want to see some other really cool photos, you can actually go straight from there to our inspiration gallery. And every photo, what we're trying to illustrate are interactions between flora and fauna, between plants and animals. And so every photo has a great caption to tell you what's going on. Here's a potter wasp on common milkweed, more bumblebees visiting Dutchman's breeches, etc. I won't go through all of these, but hopefully these are photos and stories and explanations to get you excited about the ecological value of your garden. Going back up to here, this section here, Know Your Landscape, is the section that's designed to give you some really basic principles and explanations of part of what we've talked about tonight. What are native plants? What are invasive plants? Why our philosophy about every landscape matters. Our principles for ecosystem approaches summarized here, understanding the soil and site, the leaf litter, the types of things we're talking about. We've got a great page, thank you Meredith, on plant terminology so that you can really understand how plants are named, etc. And more of that. I also want to direct your attention to the Great Resources tab on the site. Every single page in here has wonderful things for you to access and use. So the best books, about 30 different books, or probably, actually, I think there are about 45 different books here that we recommend as resources. You get a quick explanation of what they all are, whether they might be valuable to you. We have a page with databases, so great other resources to use for learning about invasive plants, a couple plant selection databases and things to explore there. Articles that you can download, summaries of the articles from our e-newsletter. Probably the most used page on our website after our homepage is our nursery page. This is many different sources for both native plants and for seeds, conventional sources, smaller nurseries, seeds and plugs, etc., plant sales. And the one other thing I will direct you to is our experts videos. We have on our website almost 20 different videos, which are professional recordings of our Evenings with Experts lectures. I know some of you may have come to our Evenings with Experts lectures, which are usually at the Cambridge Public Library. Every video is fully edited, and each of them are about an hour, and you can pause it, stop it, but I think you'll find that the quality of the production is such that you can see the speaker's slides.
Pollinators depend on would go extinct, which is about 80 to 90% of all the plants on the planet.
That particular video is the talk we just had with Doug Tallamy in February. We actually held it at Harvard at the Science Center. We had 620 people attending that lecture. And if you were to start with any video, I would say go to Nature's Best Hope. It's a fantastic introduction to the subject. You won't want to miss that. We have resources about the Commonwealth showing you the ecoregions of Mass, et cetera, et cetera. I won't spend more time on this because I'd like to take some questions. And we'd love your support. Sections on About Us. So with no further ado, Meredith, are you there?
I am here.
You didn't interrupt me once with any questions.
No, I didn't. Well, we didn't have too many very sort of urgent questions. We had mostly sort of questions that I've been storing for the end.
Okay.
And I think there are some that can certainly be answered by pointing people to certain resources on the website.
Okay.
So we had a couple questions about determining what plants are invasives, or what plants would be on the prohibited list. How to find that out.
Yep.
And related to that, would a plant like lily of the valley be considered invasive? Why or why not?
Okay, I would love to answer that question. And what I'm going to do is just for a second, I'm going to try to screen share again. See if this works. So are we seeing the flora and fauna databases, Meredith?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so if you go to this section of our website, you can go down to invasive plants and their management, and we can take you straight to the Massachusetts prohibited plant list, which is here. You can also get it by going straight to the Massachusetts site. But again, what we're trying to do with our website is make it a portal of information and make it easier for you to get all kinds of information. So then once you're here, you can explore the plants that are on that list. The second part of the question about lily of the valley, is that,
Yes.
am I skipping anything?
Yes.
So lily of valley does not make it onto the Massachusetts prohibited plant list. There are quite a number of plants that I think most of us that grow native who work with gardens would not want to plant ourselves and might prefer to see moving towards the prohibited plant list. I think the reason it's not on the plant list is that while it is very aggressive and takes over huge spots and is detrimental to growing a lot of other plants, particularly wildflowers, the large scale damage is not as dramatic as it is for some of the bigger species, but that gets debated. Lily of the valley is not a plant I would want in my garden, and it is a plant that I have managed to eradicate from my garden and to keep out since I found it there.
All right. So another one similar to that. Can you explain what a cultivar is?
Okay. Well, I won't skip back to the plant terminology page on the website, but I would suggest checking that out. Cultivars are complicated. So what a cultivar is in some ways is simple. A cultivar is a plant that is reproduced clonally so that every offspring is genetically identical to the parent plant. Now, the question is, what was the cultivar derived from? And that's what makes it complicated. So some cultivars are created from a naturally occurring plant that was found in the wild. And somebody liked that particular flower and said, I'm going to collect this plant and genetically clone its material so that when I create the offspring, they all have exactly that same flower or exactly that same quality that I liked about that plant. That would be the closest thing to, again, a true native plant that was then clonally propagated. Other cultivars are created, a lot of them are created by crossbreeding, by hybridizing plants between a native plant and sometimes a non-native plant, or sometimes between two different native plants. So in that case, the cultivar is creating a plant that didn't get generated through wild processes, was created by human breeding, and then cloned from there. Do you want to add anything to that, Meredith, since you wrote the plant terminology page?
Yes. I think the main thing to keep in mind about cultivars is that cultivar is can be considered a cultivar is a very broad term, and I'm just getting a question here that says, are cultivars considered native? So that really depends. That would depend on how the cultivar was derived. So there are many cultivars that are hybrids of two different kinds of plants. So there might be a hybrid of, say, the American witch hazel and a Chinese witch hazel. Or there might be a plant that is a clone of a naturally occurring flower that was found that had some sort of special characteristic that is, it is sort of native, but all of the ones that you're planting in your garden are all clones. So I think the question is, to a certain extent, less is it native and more what ecological value does it have. Specifically to can pollinators still use it? Can the insects that might eat it still use it? And I think the answer is if it is in any way hybridized, particularly with a non-native plant, then the answer is likely no. But the sort of upshot is that we don't know really what ecological value cultivars have, because there really hasn't been enough research looking into that. Because when horticulturists are developing new plant varieties, you know, they're selecting for things like hardiness and bloom size, and they don't do any sort of analysis on our insects still using this plant. And we do have one of the videos that Claudia demonstrated on the website does focus on this issue, some initial research. But it is important to sort of take a look at what kind of cultivar you're buying and how much it has been modified from the original flower.
Yeah, I would say there's general consensus that if the flower has been significantly modified, that's going to have a negative impact on the pollinators or whichever animals have that close evolutionary relationship with that particular plant, because it is, the relationships are often around the flower and around pollination. The video that Meredith was referring to is by Annie White. It was a lecture that Annie White gave back in 2017, how native plant cultivars affect pollinators. She was doing, this is PhD research that she did, where she measured pollinator visits to cultivars versus true native species that were not cultivars, and found that in general there was a lot less pollinator visitation for the cultivars, although in one case she found the opposite. So I do recommend watching that video. The other complexity is that just pollinator visitation also doesn't capture some of the subtleties of what's happening with pollinators. So for example, when bumblebees are visiting plants, they may be visiting to get pollen, or they may be visiting to get nectar. They may not get nectar from the same plant they get pollen from. Pollen is used for different purposes. So it can get pretty complex, but somewhat safe to assume that if we're making dramatic changes, again, particularly to flowers, there's been no time in the system for the pollinators to adapt. And that evolutionary adaptation has taken a long time to get to where it is now. The other thing I would say that I have noticed, in particular with winterberry, with Ilex verticillata, a lot of the cultivars have bigger berries. And I certainly have observed that the birds don't like the bigger berries as much as the true native Ilex verticillata berries. It's harder to get the straight species Ilex verticillata, but I would strongly prefer those. And in my garden, I actually was able to get the straight species and grow a bunch of that. And I did take out a cultivar that I had put in many years ago because the birds were not eating the larger berries.
All right. Another, yes?
Oh, I'm noticing the question about anemones, and I was wondering if we want to talk about anemones.
Yes, we certainly can. That was one that was asked early on. I think quickly, I just wanted to throw in, there was a question about, are native plants available at regular garden centers or only specialty stores? So again, I would direct you to our website page showing nurseries. I think that page has the best sources of native plants. At the larger nurseries or garden centers, you're going to get a mix of natives and non-natives. It tends to be only small nurseries, small specialty nurseries that would sell only natives. The truth is that to get a whole range of species, you're going to need to use different sources. I found that I really had to develop, to use as many natives as I've used in my landscape. I
got my favorite suppliers, but I probably used 10 or more different suppliers over the years. We do have a plant sale that we're still hoping to run despite COVID-19 in June. And if you're a member of Grow Native at the family advocate level and above, you will get, you'll be eligible to pre-order plants for that sale. This year, we're not able to have the regular day of sale with hundreds of people coming, but we will have a pre-order process. And Meredith is working hard right now to source this year's plants from about 4 different nurseries, which is a reduced number than we normally use. But again, we're all having to do things a little bit differently given coronavirus. But go check out the nursery page on the website, because there actually are a lot of good sources, and there's some good mail order sources, and it's fun to learn about them.
Do you want to go to the anemone question?
Anemones? Yeah, help me out on this one, Meredith. I want to make a comment that, yes, I don't think there are any anemones on the prohibited plant list. I don't know, I'd be curious to know where that question arose from. Of the native anemones, there is an anemone that I'm familiar with because I used it in my garden called the Canada anemone, Anemone canadensis, that actually exhibited some extremely remarkable behavior for me. It's a beautiful anemone. If any of you know Bill Kalina's book on wildflowers, it is actually the plant that graces the cover of that book. And I had it in my front garden for years in somewhat shaded conditions, and also with the competition of a street tree, Norway maple, and some old privet hedge. And that anemone sat there and it didn't grow much, and I always liked its little flower, and it was kind of like, okay, there's a little Canada anemone there. And then one year the Norway maple died and was taken down, and I took out my privet hedge, and it became very sunny all of a sudden. And within 2 months or 3 at the most, 1/4 of my entire front garden was nothing but Canada anemone. And I could not believe the rate at which it was taking over and reproducing. So it's a native plant in those conditions that are all of a sudden inherited quickly. It became the dominant plant. And that was learning a lesson about aggressiveness and saying, and I took it out entirely. I said, I don't want you taking over my entire front. On the other hand, there are times where, like, if you were competing with goutweed or something else, or you're in certain wooded situations, you might want to put Canada anemone in and have it do its thing. So this is an example where plants can behave very differently depending on whether they're given the optimal conditions. Now, I don't think I know of another plant that I've seen behave that differently in different circumstances, but so I'm curious whether whoever asked that question was asking about the native. There are lots of other anemones too, which aren't same as Canada anemone. Do you want to add something, Meredith?
I would just say that it's a good reminder that invasive is not the same as aggressive. There are plenty of native plants that are quite aggressive, like this Canada anemone. Poison ivy is another good example of a native plant that is quite aggressive that might not be one that we'd consider as something we want to have in gardens. But these very aggressive native plants also can have a significant amount of ecological value in a way that the extremely aggressive non-native plants would not. Like poison ivy has a tremendous ecological value in a way that bittersweet, which is a invasive non-native vine, does not have the same ecological value. So that's an important marker.
Claudia and Meredith, this is Andrea. I'm going to suggest that we stop the recording and we let people open up their videos if they want to ask some live questions. And I believe there's still a chat question. How does that sound?
Sure. I mean, I think maybe starting with a few of the chat questions, if Meredith, if you'd still curate them, would be helpful.
If Meredith can finish off the few chat questions that remain, then for the people who are still here who want to ask you a direct question, they can. I'm going to stop the recording right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.